Okay, so welcome to Ann Arbor. My name is Youngju Ryu, and I'm the director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies, which is one of the many centers, area centers housed here at the International Institute. Um, my job actually is just to welcome Dr. Rory Walsh. I will talk a little bit, Rory, so please don't worry, you don't have to get up here yet. But I did want to say, because some of you are new to the center, I did want to say a little bit about the center to introduce you to who we are and what we've been doing before welcoming you all. So the Nam Center for Korean Studies became a center in about 15 years ago. And compared to some of the other centers here in the International Institute, such as the Center for Japanese Studies, which was founded in 1948, or Center for Chinese Studies, which was founded in the 1960s. We are, shall we say, a teenager. But compared to some of the other Korea centers that are coming into existence around the country, I think we're getting to be a point we're entering something like the middle phase of life, maybe. So I'd like to say that we have the energy of a teenager and also the maturity of a player that's been around for a while. One of our real signature differences is the support of our donor and donor's family in the community, and that is a Nam family who has been extremely devoted to making Korean studies at University of Michigan a leader for the country. We have, as you can see from our newsletter, a slate of events every year, which is impossible to carry out without our comparable support given by the staff. So we're just really excited to launch our 12th annual Perspectives on Contemporary Korea conference, which began with a conference on Hallyu, on K-pop, 12 years ago, and we've kind of come full circle to address another aspect of a global phenomenon having to do with Korea and Korean culture, and that is the food. At a time when the news coming out of Korea is singularly bad and getting worse by the day, just on the way to campus this morning, I heard on NPR about, for the first time since the Korean War, the two Koreas have been launching missiles into that space, into the sea. And of course, the recent tragedy in Itaewon. It's really actually nice to be able to come around and be around the table on a topic coming out of Korean culture that we can all celebrate and be festive about. So that allows me to introduce Dr. Rory Walsh, who is listed as co-organizer with me, but as those of you who have come and been corresponding with Rory know, she has really been the organizer, and not only the organizer, but the architect, the builder, the interior designer, wherever that metaphor will take me. And someone who has been really invaluable member of the Nam Center for Korean Studies for a few years now. So Dr. Rory Walsh is an archaeologist by training and has a PhD received a PhD from University of Oregon. And is a specialist and has a book on Mahan and Baekje, which is just a mind trip for me, just in and of itself. And she has been at the Nam Center wearing many, many hats over the time that she's been with us. and most recently as the faculty advisor for our undergraduate programs. Very successful set of programs that I think other places are trying to benchmark, actually. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring Dr. Walsh to the stage, and she can properly welcome you all and get this conference on its way.
Hi. It's so wonderful to be here and to be meeting so many of you in person for the first time. Just thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Ryu, for that very flattering introduction. I don't quite recognize who you're describing, but I'll take it. And just welcome everyone, panelists, discussants, guests, all to this really exciting and hopefully delectable conference, Korea Around the Table. So as Dr. Yu said, I am an archaeologist. I also have an abiding interest in food. They do go together. Many archaeologists do study food, often because we have to, because if humans have been living in a place and leaving things behind, some of those things are going to be food. Sometimes the only things they leave will be food. Animal bones, plant remains, cooking pots, serving vessels. Sometimes you even get the patterns of tilled fields. I believe Dr. Lee will be showing you. And I personally have spent hours upon hours bent over a microscope in the lab of Dr. Kyung-Ali, who's our first speaker today, sorting through sediment samples to pull out charred seeds that give us a glimpse of the diet of ancient peoples. And then I spent even more hours at a different microscope measuring those seeds over and over again, micrometer by micrometer, hundreds of seeds. It's almost embarrassing. All to get a sense of how the changing ways that people were cultivating and consuming plants reflected the larger social changes happening as societies centralized into states. You may hear a research theme there, Mahan and Baekje centralizing into states. That's my thing, but we won't talk about that today. But the underlying logic there is clear that food structures our lives from the level of daily practice all the way up to global political relationships. So precisely because food is so fundamental to our lives, the discipline of food studies has always been broad-ranging and sometimes can be a little hard to pin down. Food is, of course, also what structures our bodies. So food studies touches on nutrition, food insecurity, and other inequalities that affect public health. I'm delighted we actually have a couple registered dietitians here with us today. And since we are animals, we eat the organisms we share the planet with. So food studies also includes issues of environmental impact and sustainability. And food is big business. So many researchers investigate the vast and rapid changes in food production that have resulted in the agricultural industries that provide us most of what we eat today. This conference brings together scholars from sociology, linguistics, history, literature, anthropology, and archaeology to take a focused look at Korean food in its social context, both in Korea and around the world. Through examining Korean food, those of us gathered here will ask questions about daily life and identity, about gender and social class, ethnicity and race, and about who is Korean and how people are defining and redefining what being Korean means through noodles, dumplings, soybeans, through pancakes, peppers, pears, and pork belly. Now, I actually have some data to back up the urgency of the mission for what we're doing here today. I do love quantitative data. I don't know if you've guessed that yet. But here in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, in winter 2020, the advising office shared the search terms that our students had used the most often in finding their courses for that semester. To give you some context, sports is 4th, film is 10th, aliens and wine are 21 and 23, respectively. But number 1, which was in fact unchanged from the previous year, was food. And number 2 was nutrition. So food actually took the top 2 spots. And at 31, sandwiched between medicine and fashion is Korean. And that year, Korean was new to the list, but it beat both Chinese at 45 and Japanese at 50. So the registrar shared this information partly to encourage faculty to give students what they want, an intellectual examination of food, whatever the discipline. And I figure if it's Korean food, all the better. So those of us here are answering that call. Some of us already teach courses in either on or incorporating the study of Korean food. Many of us will. And all of us are here to put ourselves in conversation about what we are learning about Korea and Koreanness from the fundamental human experiences of growing, cooking, and eating food. So with that, I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to all of you who are here joining in this conversation, both in this room and who are joining us online. It's really, truly wonderful to see you all here today. And I would like to thank all of the staff who have made this possible here at the NOM Center. I am going to make you do a little stand and wave. So we're going to start with Kelsey Langton, who is very special to us. Kelsey's our center administrator, but this is also her last event at the NOM Center. She is moving on. And so if you see us really occupying Kelsey's time, it's because these are the last couple of days we get to pretend that we'll get to spend all the days with Kelsey in the future. So thank you so much, Kelsey, not just for today, which she was extraordinary at helping me plan, but for everything, basically. Thank you. And I'd like to recognize Evan Vowell, who I believe all of our in-person attendees are very familiar with at this point. He has helped with all of the logistics, getting your travel all arranged, and is just really fun to be around. So thank you, Evan. And over at this end of the room, we have Kate Clemzito. Thank you so much. Kate is our outreach coordinator, and she is also an absolute expert at pulling off a hybrid conference. So if you notice, wow, this went really smooth today, you can thank Kate. No pressure. Okay. And is Peggy here, or did Peggy's downstairs? Okay, well, if you see Peggy, we thank her too. And I'd also like to shout out to Dave, who is running the tech for us with Kate as well. Thank you, Dave. All right. Thanks, everyone. I really could not have done this alone. Honestly, this team at the NOM Center is the best team I've ever worked with. Oh, Kyung-ah is in the audience. I should say the second best team I've ever worked with. So I'd like to go ahead and get this conference started. So I'll invite up our discussant for the first panel, Dr. Miranda Brown, who is the Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of Chinese Studies here at the University of Michigan, and as you may have guessed, is our resident expert on food in Asia. So who better to start things off for us? Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Yes, if you would just, the other discussants may appreciate knowing this, just if you would just come up and briefly introduce the speakers, and then we'll get started with our first panelist. I can leave this program on the, yeah, we can do that. Comments at the end, and then Q&A. It's all going to work out. Okay. Do you need a pen?
This is good. Hello, everybody. I'm Miranda Brown. I'm on my 4th cup of coffee this morning, so welcome. I also just want to mention really briefly that if you know anybody on campus who's planning to teach with the kitchen or would like to, please get in touch with me. I have heard from the capital projects manager on campus, and we may eventually have a kitchen. So this is the moment to all go and tell people what you want. And then I'll stop with that announcement. Okay, so I'm introducing the speaker on food and archaeology and history. So this is the pre-modern slot, I think, this morning. And I will introduce the speakers. I apologize in advance. I don't have advanced Korean. I have 0 Korean. So if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, just forgive me. So I guess our first paper is by Kyung-ha Lee, professor at the University of Oregon, and the paper will be The Origins of Korean Bread and Butter, Rice and Soybean. And then do you want me to introduce them all right now? And then, okay. Then our second essay paper will be by Song-ki Kwak, assistant professor, and Songji Jong Lee, a PhD student from Kyungpook National University. And the paper is entitled New Approaches in Tracing Prehistoric Korean Foodstuff, Application of Archaeological Chemistry. The third essay is by Suyong Sun, associate professor at Cornell University, and the essay is entitled Sa Sa Jong Jol and Shifting Meanings of Cooking in Late Joseon Korea. And then finally, Niam Kalway, a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, is going to be talking about the introduction of chilies into Korean cuisine, a comparison with the Iberian Peninsula. So as you can tell from the sampling, we have wide-ranging essays that encompass very, very different approaches. So I'm excited about hearing more about the research, and please help me welcome the speakers this morning.
Good morning, everyone. My voice might be a little bit cracking. I arrived here past midnight, so if my voice doesn't deliver to the end, just raise the hands. I'll just raise my voice. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. This is my fourth visit. First twice visit were when I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto to meet my friends here, and third time is here for conference organized by Dr. Elizabeth Berger about Chinese prehistory, and this is my first time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing and listening more about interdisciplinary research beyond my own scope. Thank you. So can I use this mic too? Okay, I'll just use this one. So first, slide. Okay, those are the images that you probably think about Korean food. But most of those here in the images, such as chili, as you will hear later this panel, was not in prehistory food item. Those are only introduced quite late, as well as those meat beef. Cattle was probably introduced much later, early historical period. So today, I want to start to show you how we know what we know, how archaeologists can talk about the food without any written recipe or any written documentations. We use all kinds of methods, as Dr. Rory Walsh just mentions. As you see here, Dr. Rory Walsh literally squeezing the food out of the stone tools to take some food residue from the grinding stone tools, as well as all those students are working numerous hours very carefully under the microscopes to identify charcoal remains, to know about what kind of food prehistoric, early historical people ate, cooked, and discharged it. We archaeologists also work at the field too. As you see, what we do is we carefully diagnose what each soil strata, which period is each soil strata belong to, and we took soil samples. Basically, we love dirt. We took the dirt and we treated dirt as if it's a gold. And also, right picture is we sometimes like real archaeologists, like Indiana Jones is not a real archaeologist, but as a real archaeologist, we go to the places, including the cave. The last photo was excavation last 2021 in Jeju Gosan Cave, which probably people dropped by and lived a short time about 8,000 years ago. And we do flotation. Flotation is basically washing the soils to collect the plant remains from soil remains from either kitchen area, house floor, garbage dump. So we love what prehistoric or past people discharge it, the throw away. That's our study stop. More photos for how we work. Basically, we work almost more indoor after few weeks, sometimes few months of excavations. And we curated the data, and we discuss, we interact, we combine all kinds of different data. So archaeological work often is group work, is collaborative efforts to get all kind of data applied by many different methods, many different ideas. So Dr. Rory Walsh was my first student, and she's used a lot of hours in the lab and helped our project ongoing. The other method is using the pottery, because many part archaeologists didn't collect sediment samples, so many of the important Korean prehistoric sites didn't have any soil residue left. Excavation is one episode incident. After excavated, it cannot be recovered. So we use the pottery, whether pottery has any signature of food residue or grain impressed in pottery surface. Probably Dr. Kwak will talk about more chemistry of food. I'll talk about more plants today. That is my major part. We do also experiment. My experiment was in greenhouse, cultivating ancient East Asian crops with all those students in my class. Also, we collect modern samples to make reference samples. And we share our research in the conferences, either poster or presentations. You can see Dr. Rory Walsh is one of the conference in Boston. And we invite the people to share the idea, learn more about each other's research. And we publish as like any other fields. Often it is multi-authored papers. So some of our team's topic is a broad spectrum resource use, basically all kinds of different food, how prehistoric people procured, cultivated, raised, and made the food out of it, and sustained the family and community and society. And here is Dr. Rory's contributions, very important work, how millet, early millet farming, we can trace how those millet where was the millet were cultivated and consumed. So she basically studied about consumer and producer based on very small seed in laboratory analysis. And the broader, I also work on Korean, particularly Neolithic and Bronze Age sites to understand their beginning. My research title is a little bit deceiving because we don't know actually Neolithic is the Korean ancestor or not. But in Korean, archaeological standpoint is not that important. Important is how people adapted and procured and made their living in the past. And also, one of the topic today is rice. Rice has such an important symbolic meaning that I will talk about later. So I talk about really rice farming was really important in the past, then when. Also, I talk about a lot of farming techniques along the Nam River alluvial floodplains. And broaden the perspective, I compare how domesticated plants were spread around in East Asia and what is the social interaction among different groups of people in the past. So traditional ecological knowledge, one of the topic and perspectives I'm interested in it, how people use their ecological knowledge over their living environment and made out of their living, and how transmitted this knowledge, probably most of the part orally. And this is still some vestige left in our current culture too. So this is actually started more cultural anthropology and conservation field. But as an archaeologist, this is the knowledge that we want to know how past people lived in certain environment, how we can compare. So I'm starting with the Jeju Island. So one of the book called Concise's Reference for Famine Relief, written in 16th century, talk about 851 eatable wild plants and cooking method, particularly in very lean season, like late spring, before you can harvest wheat and barley, and all those your stock and really getting low. And the poem that I'm showing here, it is a common folk song in Gyeonggi province surrounding Seoul about how girls and women collect wild eatable plants to sustain their table for their mother and father, brother and sister. So by looking at this, we can see how particular wild plants, eatable plants, sometimes not eatable like tree bark, are really important part of food and culture in Korea through the history time. And I believe this is not just history time. It is probably for a long time ago when humans start to live in Korean Peninsula. We just don't have written record like this. So that's the part of my research interest. Often archaeologists and look for the big remains, like big animal remains, big hunters or fishers. However, like many of the household, often women are food provider and center of household. And often ethnographically, culturally say women are collector of the wild plants in many culture. I think women have been really invested the food and health of the family from a long time. Often it is underemphasized. So I'm also interested in how gender divided labors and how gender's role often disregarded and not took as important as a big hunter, like men's big group hunters work. So Dr. Rory, Walsh and I and other teams work in Jeju Island a few years and surveyed all those sites in green dot along the coast, because you can see along the coast has a lot of marine resources and easier to move around, and many different reasons. One of the key site that we work is Gosanli site on the coast. Look like this. And often people think because it's on the coast, fish and shellfish are important food source. Of course, fish can be important food source, but I also wondered, people cannot just live with the protein. So what else? So my students and I surveyed and also documented the traditional way of farming on Jeju Island. Jeju is a volcanic island and not much under groundwater. So rice farming is very rare, but in that area has wetland and water and ground, so it was traditionally rice farming was possible. And there is the marshland nearby. So what you see is the jobs tiers. The reason that I was doing the jobs tier is we found the starchy grains of possible wild jobs tier from the grinding stone tool remains from this Jeju Gosanli site, which dating 10,000s to 4,000 BP, like this. And also we found some kind of glass, particularly like millet family glass, seeds, starch grains from the stone tools, and also some of them like cucurbita, and like as you see, snake gold. Starch remains is harder to identify because starch looks very similar, even more than carbonized seeds. So we use the reference sample, and we approximately identify those in 3 different groups. So what I can see, even with the mere data, as early as 10,000 years ago, these Jeju Islanders utilized plants nearby to assist their living and as a medicine, as a food. So also those wild plants remains that can be used for greens. Of course, all kinds of different Neolithic sites, like Bibongli shell midden site with a shell dump site. A lot of animal remains and fish remains and shells were found. But as you see, lots of acorns. Acorn has been very important starch food source historically and also prehistorically, at least from Neolithic period, dating as early as 8,000 years ago in Korean Peninsula. So I talk about all those wide eatable plants in Neolithic period. Then question is whether Neolithic period people in Korean Peninsula actually cultivated anything. As you see, many Korean as children often heard from parents, 밥이 보약이다 means meal, particular rice meals, is your medicine. So eat your meal well fully. And millets, particularly East Asian millet, like foxtail millet and broncon millet, are two East Asian millet that were domesticated along the Yellow River Hwanghae in northern China as early as 10,000 years ago. Those millets were identified as charred carbonized seed remains at the bottom of the southeast coast of Korea called Dongsamdong site in Busan Harbor. Looks like this. Again, lots of fish shell remains on the floor. By curating the soil sample, I was able to find many different two millet remains on the floor, the evidence of cooking, as well as on the pottery. But as I mentioned, the soil samples are very rare. So I look for the pottery remains, whether there's grains as a byproduct used as a temper to make a pottery, because plants temper often prevent breakage while it is in the kiln. So we found a lot of grain remains like this along by checking with scanning electron microscope. They are broomcorn and foxtail millet as early as 8,500 to 8,000 years ago. So about 1,500, 2,000 years later, those millets were spread widely from all along the Yellow River, as well as northeast China, which is a border province with North Korea, and also very bottom tip of the Southeast Korea. And one of the Neolithic sites along the east coast, which is not far from DMZ, archaeologists found a Neolithic farming field too. This called raised field, which is often farmed for dry crops, not like rice, which needs the irrigation. Those farming technique is based on rainfall. Of course, this site we also found the millet, as you see here. So middle one is the modern one that we took the photos, and left and right was from Neolithic pottery that was identical. So we wondered, why the millet? Why bother Neolithic people farm the millet? Why, when they can gather the food, wild plants, as well as hunt and fish? Often farming needs labors and planning and techniques. So archaeologists one of the biases, farming needs technology and labors and needs certain kind of social organizations and labor intake. So it's probably not possible Neolithic people doing it as early as like 8,000 years ago in Korean Peninsula. What I did with the greenhouse experiment is how easy millet to be grown. We planted January 18th in the greenhouse. We only give the water once a week in this small pot that you see. We were able to harvest from April 18th in 3 months. And we used heirloom variety that was initially collected from North China, 1920s. And those heirloom millets, were behave like almost weedy wild plants. So it's asynchronous mature period, so we would able to harvest several weeks. So here we go. Millet doesn't need a lot of preparations. It can grow like in the pot, like this, and not much effort needed, and is one of the toughest crop. So I have only 1 minute left, so I move into the soy sauce. Another plants that we really interested in is soy sauce, soybean, because soybean is kind of beef from the field and protein and the basic source for all kinds of sauce. In Neolithic site, not just the millet, as you see here, I filled along this Nam River in south side, which has a multi-component sites, which means from Neolithic to Joseon period, almost unbreak living evidence from archaeological site in this along the Nam River site. One of the garbage pits, as you see here, and also outdoor oven, like a fireplace. We found many seeds, including millets and soybean. It seems to be soybean was important source from the Neolithic period very early on. And also I did experiment with wild soybean. It seems to be wild soybean harvesting is very productive, and by simple method, we can get eatable soybean soy sauce very easily. So it seems like wild soybean was grown automatically in their farming field, millet farming field, as collected as kind of famine food, and then it probably start to domestication experiment. This chart showing through the time how soybean sauce changed through the time. So size increased. Size matter in domestication. With the domestication, human intervention, seed size increased through time. As this chart showing, measuring about 10,000 soybeans archaeological seeds from China, Korea, and Japan, we documented correlation between size and time. Rice farmers. Can I have 1 or 2 more minutes? Because I need to finish the rice, because the title of the talk is Rice and Soybean. So I'll huddle through the rice. As you see this gentleman, you can see how amazingly big bowl of rice that he has. Over the time, rice has been historically really important, practically because it's taxation item through the Korea and Joseon dynasty, and is important agriculture. However, rice never been a main food for the people, common people, up until 1970. Because 1970 there was a variety developed which is tough for drought and all kinds of pesticide. So as you see this poem, which is written by a scholar in Korea dynasty, the common people have a pride as a rice farmer because we feed the royal. But second sonnet is how high tax, because of how high tax they suffer from. As you see, but rice has never been really main food for commoners. It's more richer food. As you see, shaman right here. They're offering the rice, the women's, as you see here. And we found dry field and rice field archaeological site, at least from Bronze Age. So rice seems to be a food, one of the food items through the Bronze Age, dating from 3,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago. As you see here, the houses, all kinds of different houses through time. We found rice, barley, and wheat, as well as millet. So it seems to be by the Three Kingdom period, the cattle used, as you see, the yellow one and blue one. Yellow one is the black one is a human footprint next to the cattle hoop. It seems to be by the Three Kingdom period, the plow by the cattle well settled for rice farming. So Three Kingdom period with iron tools and cattle draft animal, rice production really increased. Still, it's not the commoner's food because in archaeological sites, we mostly found other foods and wild fruit like wild peach like this. One of the evidence is Haenam Gungongli site that I excavated with friends, colleagues. Rory, Walsh is also participate this effort. The Gungongli site is at the edge of the coastal south corner of the Korean peninsula, and it has located the ecotone, means there is the forest edge, coast, and marshland. It's a perfect location for rice farming and also, as well as rye farming. Interestingly, even Proto Three Kingdom period and Three Kingdom period, historical period, most of the grains are millet. And rice is increased, but also other crops like wheat and millet. So my conclusion is farming is important. However, also other food, other wild plants seen here, like acorns and wild plants and wild fruits were important part, and tuber crops, as we found from pottery, starch remains from pottery, as you see here again, snake gold, are all important part of subsistence and food culture in Korea. So often we think Korean food is rice and beef and bibimbap and bulgogi, but I think that traditions reinvented later years. Showing a couple of slides. My students work on starch showing tuber plants and other wild plants that were grounded in stone tools as well as cooked in pottery. Thank you. Sorry for I passed a couple of minutes, but I got in getting through. Thank you.
Okay. Am I allowed to start?
1 second, Seunggi. We're just
Yeah.
getting your camera spotlighted.
All right, sure. I'm sorry. I think I did not. Wait a second.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. Hello. My name is Seunggi Kwak, and we have co-presenter Soo-Jung Lee from Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at Gyeongbuk National University. I always wanted to visit Ann Arbor, but I'm really sorry that I missed this chance. But at least feel happy that I can contribute to this conference with our studies. The title of our study is New Approaches in Tracing Prehistoric Korean Food Stuff, Application of Archaeological Chemistry. So this is more like a highly technical kind of presentation. So since it incorporates the organic method of organic chemistry. So we would like to present our work, how our effort worked, and then to investigate and to get the smallest information in archaeological context to know about the ancient foods and prehistoric foods. The time span scope that I'm looking for is from around 6,000 years ago to 2,500 years ago, Neolithic and Bronze Age Korea. So as an archaeologist who study about ancient food and prehistoric foodways, the most kind of hindrance and biggest barrier for archaeologists for studying that is actually the acidity, high acidity of Korean sediment. Normally, Korean sediment is quite acid compared to other regions, so it is quite hard to grasp, hard to obtain the physical remains of plants and the fauna remains. So it's for archaeologists, that is pretty big issue in Korea. But Dr. Lee already showed that using this systematical archaeobotanical approach for carbonized seed remains, we can actually grasp some of the aspects. Ishi already mentioned about the cultivation and initial domestication of foxtail and broken millet. So this is a highly effective method. But other than that, archaeologists mostly relied on this kind of projectile points, tools, more like indirect evidences. This is projectile points. This is from Gosanri site as well, Jeju Island, and projectile points for hunting small animals, and of course the spearhead as for like hunting for fishing, and of course mortar and pestle for processing plant remains. And also in the Bronze Age, you can see the evidence of this kind of harvesting tools, stone sickles, and knife. So this is sort of like the archaeologist has to rely on those kind of evidences to overcome this kind of inherent problem limitation. Scholars start to look on this invisible molecular level of evidence. So there are a lot of zeros in there. This is just how many kind of water molecules inside of one drop of water. So basically, people try to focus on, now people try to move on their focus to invisible evidence as well. So today, what we're going to focus on is pottery, because most of archaeologists agree that in potteries, that we have really plenty of potteries from the Holocene. From the Holocene period, most of artifacts we found in archaeological site is actually potteries, and pretty common. And then many archaeologists that potteries that are excavated in open air sites, in habitation sites, those are for cooking purposes. So they are used for culinary purposes. And so like the residue of cooking, the evidence of cooking, the kind of evidence for cooking, normally first archaeologists can kind of brought up is these charred residues attached in the pottery interior part of the pot wall. But this is pretty rare because it only appears when they failed cooking. They have to burn down their food. But many of our ancestors actually did not. So this is quite rare to find these charred remains. This can be used for radiocarbon dating and further scientific analysis, but this is quite rare. So mostly what we can see is actually invisible kind of molecular level kind of evidence embedded in the pottery matrix. This is what we call lipids. Lipids, they are a mixture of naturally occurring compounds in living organisms, such as fatty acid, waxes, or sterols. They can be extracted from foodstuffs during the past human activities, like while cooking, like storaging, and ritual practices, and it can be entrapped within the archaeological context. The reason that we are focusing on pottery is because pottery has a low-fired, open-fired pottery of prehistoric time, Neolithic and Bronze Age. They have pores. They have void inside. So it is easy for kind of lipids can embed it inside through the interior wall while cooking practices. So fire clay act as a trap. In that context, fire clay acted as a trap or net, protecting and preserving lipids during these post-deposition practices. And also, it has an advantage that it cannot be removed from sample by washing or scraping and remain within the ceramic matrix of the pot until extracted by solvents. So how do we extract these kind of ancient molecules, ancient trace of food inside of pottery using this kind of method? So it is destructive method. Actually, we have to kind of crush down pottery to powder, but we only need about 5 grams. So it might not that be a problem for archaeologists actually. So we ground up pottery to produce a powder and add solvents like acids. So we sonicate, we basically shake it in really high speed, and lipids and release from the clay matrix and dissolve into the solvent. So this is what I took there while I'm doing the process. Actually, you can see this kind of yellowish color. These are lipids. Basically, these are fats, oils. Dissolve in the solvent, you can see. So when you see this kind of thing, now you can feel at least first it's relieved that there's something inside there. And then you can also transfer into clean vials and collect this. So after collecting these lipids, then we incorporate 2 different kind of chemistry machine. One is called GCMS. It's organized with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. GC is to use for identify and separate each individual organic compounds from lipid mixture, and MS is used for calculating the amount of individual organic compound within the within the lipid mixture. So the result normally comes like this chromatogram. So each individual peaks indicates different type of organic compound within the lipid mixture, and the size and the height of the peak indicates the amount of the organic compound. So there are some different type of, so obviously different kind of food has different shape of this chromatogram. So there are some of the certain type of organic compound that only found in certain type of food. So they're what we call biomarkers, 생체 지표. So for example, C4 plants, C4 fatty acids, 지방산, they're common in milk fat, and plant oils, there are normally unsaturated fatty acids, 불포화 지방산. And animal oils, they're mostly such as cholesterols. And for aquatic marine resources, there are certain type of acids like titanic acids or pristanic acids, or thermally produced. This was only produced when they're heated up to 300 Celsius degree from polyunsaturated fatty acid. 고도 불포화 지방산. So these are the kind of general biomarkers. But the problem is they're really unstable. So they actually degrade during the post-deposition process, during the thousands of post-deposition process. But so what we normally get as archaeological lipids is this two different fatty acid, which is really common. So it's common in everywhere. Actually, now it is the C16 and C18 fatty acid. They are probably really a ton of C16 and C18 fatty acid within my hands, probably. So with everyone's hands, so basically. These are C16 fatty acid is most widespread fatty acid. It actually literally including every single organism. So present in all plant and animals, both terrestrial and marine too. And then C18 fatty acid is little less, quite common, but less widespread in C16 fatty acid. So usually, and then it's uncommon to terrestrial mammals. So since it is usually uncommon in terrestrial mammals, if you compare the amount of C16 and C18, you can have a small amount of C18. You can actually kind of assume that as a plant resources, and you can have, if you see lots of C16 and C18 together in the chromatogram, then you can see roughly make it as a terrestrial mammal. But this is not enough. This detail is not enough for archaeologists to divide and search for ancient food waste. So we can incorporate another method. It's called isotope analysis. Specifically what we call compound-specific isotope analysis. Actually, isotope analysis is quite now it's established method in archaeology for tracing ancient food waste in foods. So the logic behind here is changing ratio between carbon isotopes inside of carbon dioxide during the photosynthetic process of plants. Certain plants, different type of plants has different type of photosynthetic methods. So they actually prefer certain type of isotopes instead of other ones. So during the photosynthetic process in the plants incorporate those two carbon isotopes inside of their plants with different ratios. So if you by calculating these different ratios of the carbon isotope of different plants, we can actually grouping those plants, different type of plants. And of course, plants is eaten by herbivores and herbivores eaten by carnivores. Both three plants and herbivores, carnivores are eaten by humans. So it actually accumulates inside those different kind of animals. So eventually by using this logic, we can actually divide different type of food groups, such as C3 plants, rice, barley, and leguminous, for example, soybeans and zucchinis, and C4 plants, millet, and like both broom corn and foxtail millet, and also like maize, for example, which is corn, which is not common in Korea, but still they are included in C4 plant groups. So, and then also animal resources like ruminant animals, like deer, cattle. Mostly in prehistoric time, we assume ruminant animals in deer, and then porcines, which is rice, boars, and aquatic, both marine resources. So we can actually divide our food into our lipids into these different type of food groups. So, so basically, which place that I can take samples from these lipids? It's pretty actually logical, because normally when you cook, considering you're cooking and you're eating Korean soup, like this Jjajangmyeon, and then you'll see a lot of like oils and floating on top of the water, right? And the most effective way of cooking using pottery is actually cooking together with water. So because of that, during the cooking processes, the lipids, the oil, like extracted from the organisms and float on top of the water, and then through the convection current, it can go into the interior wall. So it's already revealed that archaeologically revealed that these lipids are really, really rich in the rim part, so our upper body. So this was also kind of matched with our kind of experiment. This is our initial experiment with the bronze, Neolithic, Iron Age pottery from Haengsangupari, excavated by Yonsei University Museum back in 2013. So number A is actually the top part is the rim part of the pottery, and B is the upper body part, and then C is the bottom part. This is the chromatogram. This is C16 fatty acid and C18 fatty acid. You can see two high peaks. So you can see there's bottom part, there's literally nothing inside. So we confirmed that upper body part is and rim part is useful for analyzing this type of approach. Now I'm going to move on to some kind of traditional kind of perception of Neolithic subsistence in Korea. In Neolithic subsistence, traditionally archaeologists thought that it's a combination of hunting and fishing and gathering. And coastal hunter-gatherers intensively procured marine resources and created hundreds of shell middens, basically dumpster of prehistoric time period, and throughout the peninsula. So in those shell middens, we can easily find the fish hooks and net sinkers there. So initial domestication of millet families started as early as in middle or early Neolithic phase of Korean Neolithic, but assumed to be remain minor level. That's kind of general perception in Korea. What about Bronze Age then? Evidence of full dress farming using irrigated rice paddies and these harvesting tools. And then direct evidence of carbonized rice and barley seeds, those kind of stuff. We think that harvested crops such as rice and barley became a quite significant portion of the diet of prehistoric ancient people. So I just wanted to kind of see whether this is correct with my this new method, because these are mostly relied on kind of undirected evidences. So I'm gonna show the result from like Sosadong, Pyeongtaek City, and Songgukmi in Buya City, and Bambang, shell middens and coastal sites. So these are two are inland site, and one is inland Bronze Age site, and one is the Neolithic shell midden site. So these are GCMS results. Upper one is Sosadong. You can see a lot of C16 and C18. And then down part is Bambang shell midden site, Neolithic pottery, and you can see C16 and C18. But you can see the evidence of titanic acid, which can be used as evidence of aquatic resources. So this is quite reasonable because this is shell midden sites. Coastal areas already available, but this one is also too, because Pyeongtaek actually has a harbor these days. So it's not far from coast sites. So these people can reach to coastline to get some marine resources. I think it's possible. So, but we have to get more kind of ideas about their subsistence. So we conducted, of course, the isotope analysis. So how do we see the isotope analysis? It's rather not that difficult actually than thought. So basically we measured isotope carbon isotope ratio value of C16, both C16 and C18 fatty acid in one sample. So basically one sample has two values. So we can plot, like make a scatter plot in there. So one dot means one sample, one potsherd, one pottery. So this red circle indicates Bambang shell middens and Neolithic shell middens and Bambang, and actually the triangle, blue triangle indicates the inner Songgukmi site of Buyeol, which is one of the well-known kind of Bronze Age site incorporating rice and the social hierarchies, and we found the bronze dagger in there too. So we can see the striking differences actually between the two. When you see this kind of graph, which when dots and the data goes upper right part, that means a contribution to C4 plants and marine resources. And when the isotope value goes to down left part, that means C3 plants and terrestrial mammals, terrestrial kind of resources. So you can see inland habitation type Songgukmi indicated C3 plants, rice, barley, leguminous, and also terrestrial mammals. And this coastal site has C4 plants. Of course, we already saw that the C4 plants were available in Neolithic, so C4 plants and marine resources. So this is striking kind of differences, and we can see this kind of reflect the traditional kind of thoughts about subsistence in Neolithic in Korea. Coastal side, marine resources. Interior side, kind of rice farming and rice and barley and other resources. So, but still, during the this reflect this kind of general trend, but we were able to find new evidence as well. So especially these ruminant animals, because of their has typical kind of their kind of characteristic style of digestion process, they actually change their carbon ratio values during their digestion. And then they also produce their change carbon ratio value inside while they're producing the milk as well. So we can actually divide our further divide our isotopes into non-ruminant fats and ruminant fat and ruminant milk fat. And interestingly, we were able to find like lots of about half of our samples were indicating ruminant adipose fats. So basically, these are wild deers because cattle were not introduced in Korea in early prehistoric period. So I think these are new findings. So in Korean archaeology, the role of subsistence strategy beside farming in Bronze Age people side, because we see the overall evidence of rice. So we kind of focused on rice all the time after we entered the Bronze Age. For example, but still, for example, hunting terrestrial animals, they could have actually contribute to their diet, but has been largely underestimated because there's no preservation of bones of deers in archaeological site for preservation of organic remains. Our study offers an approach to investigate the relative contribution of various natural resources to the prehistoric diet, that overcomes this problem of differential preservation in archaeological deposits. In case of Songgukmi, the Bronze Age site was once regarded as kind of hallmark of rice farming in Korea. The results suggest that these farmers relied on hunted wild animals to a great degree than expected. So these are our kind of initial findings. Our approach also has limitations. So here are some implications. We have not sampled every habitation location at these sites. We roughly sampled 20 to 30 samples, to 30 postures inside of the habitation area. And boiling food inside of the pot is not the only method for preparing food for eating. And there may be other methods of food preparation. They did not involve pottery at all. One pot can be used for cooking various foodstuffs. So these are our general kind of implications. So we have to overcome when we using this method. Like, already like 30 plus years ago, like Robert Dunnett, one of the well-known archaeologists, he already mentioned that the unit of archaeological investigation will be a shrink into like nano or molecular level. So here we already enter into that stage. So I really hope that this kind of new approach can actually together thought as with the existing archaeological context, we can actually make a good narrative for better understanding of ancient foodways. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. First, I'd like really thanks to Dr. Rory and then staff members at NAM Center for organizing this fascinating conference. And I'm also really pleased to be here to share my ongoing project with the people who share my passion for food. Okay. So, it will show, right, okay, yeah. This paper is part of my ongoing project about cookbooks in Joseon, Korea. I'm a book historian, and I'm particularly interested in how the cookbooks mediated between the textual knowledge and embodied physical practices in late Joseon, Korea. Yeah. The first cookbook actually appeared in Joseon, Korea, Sanga Yorok, that the records of essentials for rural families was written by a royal doctor, Jeon Suni, in 1459. And then since then, there emerged some numbers of cookbooks and cooking recipes. And then particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, we saw the rise of the popularity of cookery writings and cookbooks. So far, there are more than 50 cookbooks found, and most of them were written in literary Sinitic or vernacular Korean script. A considerable number of cookbooks were written by male literati and male scholars, but also a large number of cookbooks were written, supposedly written by women, particularly in Yangban families, which is a very clear characteristic distinguished Korean cases from the China and Japan. So before I actually wrote about cookbooks themselves, I kind of really wonder, what is the meaning of cooking? And then we all know that the cooking has been the exclusive province of women, always associated with domestic and female way of life. But different historical and cultural specificity shape the relationship of cooking and gender in radically different ways. Today, I'm going to skip 1,000 years and then going back to focus on the 18th century text and then try to reconstruct that the unstable relationship of cooking with femininity and domesticity in Joseon Korea. So the 18th century text I'm focusing today is the 사소절, which is translated as minor propriety for the gentleman. And this was actually one of the most popular and influential 18th century conduct manuals for gentlemen and his family members, which was written by Lee Dong-mu in 1775. This book was really interesting because it reveals the coexistence of seemingly conflicting perceptions of cooking. Along with the major social and economic transformations after the wars with the Japanese and the Manchu, 사소절 not only represents the emergence of unprecedented interest in cooking and cookery writings in the 18th century, but it also testifies to the shifting meanings of cooking, which was no longer understood as much within the frame of an overwhelmingly moralized femininity, as a variety of set of experiences, practices, and then competencies, in which cooking was redefined as a specialized skill that needed to be learned, an indispensable component of domestic production and everyday knowledge that deserved to be textualized. So in this presentation, I will argue that the shifting meanings of cooking in 사소절 stemmed from the elite's anxieties about the encroaching power of expanding commercialization and its impact on the class hierarchy and social order. At the same time, I will also demonstrate that the scholars' new concern with the mundane practice of cooking highlighted the value of gendered labor, skill, and knowledge in the domestic sphere, which had not been fully acknowledged by the prescriptive norms of Confucian femininity. So in short, 사소절 demonstrates how the shifting meanings of cooking redefine the relationship between morality and skill, between reproductive labor and productive work, and between textual learning and somatic practice, and validate the centrality of women's work embedded in material lived experience to the cultural, economic, and social status of families in the transformations of late Joseon Korea. So first meaning I can find in 사소절 is that Lee Dong-mu first defines cooking as the primary domestic duty for women. Cooking, he writes, is foremost a wifely affair. And if the wife does not know how to do needlework, weaving, and cooking, it is the same as if the husband does not know poetry, histories, and 6 arts of gentlemen. Faithfully conforming the Confucian norms of gender division, he posits cooking as women's major work in the inner sphere, the direct counterpart of the man's work in the outer sphere. Often termed as 봉제사 접빙객, the serving the ancestral rituals and then guests visiting family. Women's cooking played as a crucial role in ancestral worship, the central family ritual for sustaining the patrilineal family and reinforcing the bonds of a patriarchal family with neighbors, kin, and wider social community via serving of the guests. Thus, the praise of women's cooking never appeared in the relationship with her husband or her children, I think which is actually pretty much stark contrast to modern cookbooks, but almost invariably comes up in relation to her alive or dead parents-in-law, that is ancestors. Beyond fulfilling the family's everyday need for sustenance,
women's cooking was mostly couched in the abstract reiteration of Confucian morality through set phrases highlighting the feminine virtue, devotion, and diligence manifested in the manner of cooking. In other words, cooking was equated with women's internalization of filial piety, the bodily habit of submission to the patriarchal and patrilineal family, and the imperative of feminine moral duty. Women's cooking was, far from being concrete physical labor, abstracted as patriarchal corporeal normativity. So it is no wonder that when we read Lee Dong-mo's lamentation of the gentle women's neglect of cooking in the 18th century, along with the increasing commercialization, urbanization, and stratification of elite Yangban class, wives and daughters in a growing number of well-off households in Seoul abandoned cooking and relied on the labor of maids and slaves. Lee Dong-mo exasperated. The ladies in Seoul do not know how to weave a cloth, and the wives of scholars do not know how to cook rice these days. He clearly indicated that women's growing detachment from the physical labor of cooking as a sign of a moral decline, and by extension, the threat of the Confucian moral order. His lament on the change of cooking practice was no exaggeration in this era because it was not uncommon that women in the elite households did not prepare food by themselves, even for the ancestor ritual, instead delegating the task to the local official kitchen. And many women could easily purchase food from the flourishing commercial market, particularly items that took intensive labor, time, and skill to make, such as tteok, rice cakes, and tteokguk, sliced rice cake soup, noodles, and liquor. This phenomenon clearly revealed that the new sense of urban domesticity emerged in Seoul in this era. Instead of ancient ideal of self-sufficient domesticity, in which women engaged in the gender-divided work separated from men in the agricultural economy, in this new urban setting, women's status was elevated, depending upon her being freed from the everyday labor of cooking. Following his lamentation, in fact, Lee Dong-mo listed nitty-gritty instructions about cooking, such as cooking hygiene, cookware preparation, cooking ingredients, and the proper flavors of food. His meticulous concern was in stark contrast to the apparent lack of information about cooking in the previous primers and textbooks for women. This was partly because the scholars were concerned with the moralization of cooking, not with the practical process of cooking, and partly because they considered cooking as a lowly, routine exercise of little significance. For example, the 18th century scholar Han Won-jin, in his instructions to his female family members, contended cooking and needlework were very simple tasks and very easy to do, and not much skill is required. For him, what matters is not the skill, but the attitude, how much women's cooking demonstrated her diligence and female virtue. But for Lee Dong-mo, it is not sufficient for women to possess wholehearted sincerity. Cooking requires a certain level of expertise. So he claims if the food is not cooked fully, not seasoned properly, not warmed up evenly, and mixed with dust and dirt, how can it offer to the ancestor spirit and serve to people? Instead of being a mundane, unvarying task for which no education is needed, he argues that cooking demands that women exercise their intellect. He insists that women should read books about cooking to get better at cooking. In other words, he insinuates the good flavor of food was achieved only by means of women's hands-on and adroit maneuvers that she learned from education, not by means of outside assistance or commodified food. Lee Dong-mo was not alone to shift his emphasis from the manner of cooking to the skill of cooking. We find unprecedented concern being voiced about the cooking abilities of female members from the 18th century on. As in this example of Sung Hae-eun, the male writer's depictions of women's cooking became very vivid and specific in this period. And he even really nitpicking at how to prepare all the chame, that the Korean melons, and then kind of jansori, and then everything, right? In fact, outstanding skill in cooking was understood to be rarely found talent, and women's excellent cookery contributed to building the reputation of the family in this era. So because of a high degree of cooking skill added cultural capital of the family, in the 18th century, many elite scholar families began to create cookbooks for themselves. The orally and bodily transmitted skill and expertise of cooking within a family was rendered in written form that was passed down as a family heirloom from generation to generation in this period. And some cookbooks were compiled collaboratively and expanded by several generations of the family members. For example, sundubu, that the miscellaneous recipes for feast, list 144 recipes of food and types of liquors collected together by the 3 generations of Kim clan of Gwangsan in Andong province. The recipes included in the book derived from many sources, including previous cookbooks and imported encyclopedia of the Yuan dynasty, regional practices, and commercial yotjip, and the sticky rice tappy shop, and then even family recipes unique to the Kim clan. So the accumulation of recipes marks the book as a collective familial project that is the physical embodiment of a flourishing patrilineal continuity. The cookbooks not only discuss the family's foodways, they also embodied the refined decorum and elegant lifestyle of the family. So Champop, the food recipes by Lady Jo of Buye in 1854, was written for her granddaughter who was about to be married off. And then actually the whole recipes are devoted how to prepare this kind of the nest of boxes, so-called the lunchbox. She not only listed recipes, but also tips for storing food and instructions on how to select good seasonal ingredients and the proper order of food and what kind of plates were suitable for each occasion. The meticulous selection of dishes for various occasions, minute details of arrangement, and attentive choice of dishes indicate the luxurious delights represented in the cookbooks were not limited to appealing to the palate of an individual, but they also intended to cultivate a carefully articulated propriety as material markers of the family's authentic yangban status. In other words, women's dexterity in cooking was placed at the fore of families' efforts to demonstrate cultural taste and social status in the increasingly blurry hierarchy both within and beyond the yangban class in late Joseon society. In short, Lee Dong-mo's meticulous concern on the proper ways of cooking asserted cooking as a cultivated feminine corporeality, which was obviously distant from the moralized femininity that prescribed every woman across class, or the ancient model of simply self-sufficient domesticity relied on women's physical labor. Almost all extant cookbooks in Joseon Korea do not mention ordinary dishes, instead spending most of their pages on extraordinary meals for special occasions. Moreover, the ingredients, recipes, and cookware clearly testify to an abundant and steady influx of indigenous and imported foodstuffs and the expansion of the possible repertoires of cooking enabled by the development of transportation and expanding market and then trade networks, which brought about conspicuous food consumption and sophistication of connoisseurship. The cookbook's recipes make use of a variety of ingredients, ranging from meats to seafood and diverse desserts, delicacies, and snacks to go with drinks is mentioned. This is a really interesting example because the back size of the sundubu that I showed before, and then it definitely said that, yeah, you really do not seek for any kind of taste in food, kind of really promote that some of the very traditional dictum and then resume of the Confucian classics on the self-restraint in food, but basically covering through the pages, and then you can see that all kinds of glamorous the food and the recipes and everything. So it's pretty much contradictory. So we definitely see that in this example that dispensing with the belief that food should be self-sufficient and ideally frugal, which is derived from the ancient economic idea of self-subsistence, food was pursued for the pleasure of various sensory enjoyment, including gustatory, visual, olfactory, and tactile ones. Unmoored from the belief that seeking flavor was indulging a bodily desire that reflected a lack of self-discipline and could lead to gluttony, the sophisticated palate symbolized the individual taste and cultural discernment and social class. Thus, when Binghegak and Yi Xi and both of her natal and marital family were distinguished metropolitan elite families, compiled the cooking recipes in 1809, she was proud of her home recipes, arguing that her cooking methods make better food than the ones sold on market streets. The authenticity and prestige attached to the homemade food demonstrate the redefinition of cooking as a highly sophisticated craft, which allowed only for the women in elite households who possessed sufficient wealth and education in the increasingly stratified 18th century Joseon Korea. The emphasis on cooking skill also led the scholars to find the potential of cooking as a means of earning economic capital. Lee Dong-mo elevates the importance of hitherto overlooked artisanal expertise, but he also kind of really promotes that the undervalued values of domestic crafts, and he argues that we should not downplay cooking as a trivial chore, but a craft that needs to be textualized and studied. Furthermore, Lee Dong-mo insisted that productive domestic craft could be turned into material account if the household needed additional sources of income. He propounds that trade is not in principle incompatible with female virtue and even encourages women to sell food items such as sauce, vinegar, alcohol, and oil. Considering that commerce was supplementary to agriculture and viewed with a moral contempt within the strict class hierarchy undergirded by the Neo-Confucian doctrine, it is rather striking to see Lee Dong-mo's encouragement of women's selling of food in order to contribute to the family's income. But as the development of commerce and expansion of trade came to deeply permeate the lives of the families in this period, it was not uncommon that women's cooking served to produce economic value. So there is a really famous example of that the mother of the scholar of Seoul, and then she became widow, and then she did not have any means for her livelihood. So basically, to educate her son, she tried to sell food like the yakgwa, soft cookies, and then yaksik, glutinous rice cakes, and then rice wine. And then her food was so extraordinary, it was really sold very well, and then even the reputation came to the ear of the king, and then king kind of really celebrated her cooking skill. And then the yakgwa we know of today is actually derived the name of her residence called Yakhyeon, because this is actually a cookie that was made by Seoul's mother in Yakhyeon. So people say that that's kind of the name, how the name originated. So selling home-made food and liquor was not the first resort for the women of Yangban families, but it seems to have been a viable option to boost the family income. As long as women's cooking generated a saleable commodity supporting the subsistence production of the family, it was not only justified, but it was further celebrated as a demonstration of female virtue in the expansion of marketization in the 18th century. So I think the time is limited, so I'm kind of really want to sum up several of the points I wanted to make more. So I think this is pretty much interesting because many of the scholars kind of really thinking that the cooking and then the women's work is pretty much restricted by the so-called very strict spatial hierarchy and then spatial demarcation. But basically, domain of cooking was pretty much expanded in the 18th century. And then everybody has a very different ideas about what really cooking means. And then some people, it means just kitchen chores. But some other people, actually, it means that all kinds of the domestic management related to that, all kinds of activities that were traditionally considered male jobs. So basically, you can see that there is a clear and then blurry boundary between the so-called reproductive work and then production. And then many more and more scholars really wanted to celebrate that the value of the women's work, in particularly in domestic maintenance and the material recreation, and then even achieving certain sense of the money and then economic means for the family. So I think it's really pretty much fascinating because that the most of the cookbooks in Joseon, Korea does not appear not as a standalone text, but as a part of the collection on household management that addressed a broad range of topics. So for example, the manuscript that the Yorok, the Record of Essentials, contain 130 recipes that foray beyond the making of food into the planting of vegetables, the raising of chickens, dogs, and ducks, and the dyeing of cloth, and the repelling of tree parasites, and the making of ink sticks and paper. And then these books demonstrate that the recipe writers did not consider cooking as a separate category of activity. It was but one domain of the expertise of running the household, which had been traditionally treated in agronomic books. So basically, agronomic books was considered a very versatile realm of the knowledge, particularly in Joseon, Korea, to subsist the lives of the people. But many of them kind of realized that all these important domestic work actually became a very important part of the knowledge that traditional agronomic books actually dealt with. And then it also acknowledged that they really demanded specialized expertise and knowledge, not just kind of really menial work. So particularly in the early 19th century, observed the emergence of the two massive collections of cooking and domestic knowledge, Lee Bing-hagak's multi-volume domestic encyclopedia, 규합총서, written in vernacular Korean script in 1809, and her younger brother-in-law, 서유구's 임원이 16지, written in literary synthic in 1842. So it is evident that both Lee Bing-hagak and Seoul demonstrated cooking was a subject worthy of intellectual inquiry, but their purposes of cooking were so different. Seoul tried to return cooking to its origin as medicine and recover its function of ancestral ritual as part of its reconstruction of self-sufficient agrarian practice. Lee Bing-hagak, by contrast, made a home-born vernacular knowledge that had been transmitted orally and somatically across classes, genders, and localities in the form of geomancy, almanacs, hearsays, and folk beliefs and taboos, the subject of materialized intellectual quandaries. Particularly, she kind of really showed that the seasonal and ecological knowledge, and then this is actually part of that the important, the modern discipline, intellectual discipline called such as nutrition, and then also chemistry, and then physiology, and then all different kinds of the science, right? But no matter how divergent their motives for writing, however, their compilations contributed to validate the discussion of cooking and encyclopedic accounts of domestic life cycles and relationships, no longer a moral discourse, but also a legitimate domain of knowledge, the boundaries of which the shifting meanings of domestic work demanded be redrawn in late Joseon Korea. For both, the domestic space was a crucial site of vibrant knowledge making, and this knowledge was far from derived from the separation of intellectual and domestic space, a form of integration of the intellectual and material inquiries that took place in the everyday space of the household. Thank you.
Sorry, just taking a second to figure this out. Cool. Right. Hi, everyone. My name's Neve. I've come from the Uni of Oxford yesterday. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I was meant to be here earlier in the year for the next conference, but as several of you know, there was some COVID. I had COVID. But it's been a long road, but I'm here, and I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, I'll crack on. So what I'm going to talk about today is the introduction of chilies into Korean cuisine, and I'm comparing it with the Iberian Peninsula for reasons that will become clear. This is the kind of roadmap of what I'll be talking about. Don't focus on it too much. It should become apparent if my talk is, clear enough. We'll figure it out. So just to introduce it, this paper is part of my wider PhD research into the interaction between Iberian food and pre-modern East Asian food, and this is the sort of Korean wing, shall we say, of my research. I'm looking at the manner in which chilies were adopted into the cuisine of the Korean Peninsula, and to what extent this mirrors their reception in Iberia. So as we'll see, even several people I talked to walking over this morning, right, were talking about how important chilies have become in Korean food, and how a lot of Korean, I've got friends who sort of talk about becoming part of Korean families or are part of Korean families already, and talk about how chilies are sort of, or eating spicy food is seen as this sort of really important thing to be able to do. When I know it's sort of hackneyed, it's obviously not true all the time, but it's a real part of the consciousness and of the national kind of identity, which, hopefully sort of later talks will talk more about that kind of idea of identity. But, I'm sort of thinking about how did it get there? These are quite recent, brought over by Iberian actors, but the spiciness doesn't characterize Iberian cuisines quite so much, other than, paprika, we know used a lot in Spanish food, but it's not, I grew up in Spain, I would never have thought of it as spicy as such, or, that chili kind of heat. So why has that happened? My methodology, I'm using quantitative to a certain extent, but largely qualitative use of primarily recipe manuscripts. Some of the ones were briefly introduced in the previous talk, so that'll be really useful that you've already got that ground knowledge. I'm going to look at the similarities and differences in trajectory of the chili in both areas. So in terms of, first of all, actors and agents, so the people who did or didn't cook and eat them, and why. And then also the dishes into which they were incorporated. So how did each region, how did they bring chilies into their food? Hopefully this will illuminate the similarities in the attitudes of upper classes towards the chili. So in both areas, we'll look at how there was actually a delay in the chili in recipe manuscripts, because the people with the wherewithal to be writing recipe manuscripts had some reservations when it first came into the food of the region, but for different reasons in each area. Although I will show that this wasn't as long a period in Korea. It was much quicker for them to get over this. And also I'll look at the similar way in which chilies were incorporated into existing recipes in both areas, rather than having their own kind of traditions and dishes. And this will also touch upon ideas of cosmology and traditional medicine in Korea in particular, as separating it from how the Spanish and wider Iberians looked at it. So having a quick look at some of my key sources. In the Korean case, we've got a series of recipe books and manuals, a couple agricultural manuals that I look a lot at Lee Ping-hogak's Kyuap Chongso, which was talked about quite heavily in the previous work. But we've got several others. We've got Chibong Yusol, we've got Salim Kyungje and Chungbo Salim Kyungje, which are more agricultural kind of manuals. And then we've got Umshik Timibang, which is another very important cookbook. And then on the Iberian side, we've got a couple from Robert de Nola. So we've got Libro del Coche and Libro del Guisados, which are both kind of Spanish Empire cookery books. Actually, he was a chef in Naples, but that being part of the Spanish Empire at the time reflects a wider Southern European cooking. And then I also use accounts from Columbus expeditions and a couple botanical works because I think they're interesting. So we expand just beyond the cookbooks. So first of all, a very quick history. Quite a lot of people will know this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Obviously, there's a long culture of eating chilies in the Americas because that's where they're from. During the Columbus expeditions from 1492 to 1504, they were generally in pursuit, they were looking to go to East Asia, generally in pursuit of spices because they were very expensive and valued. They were looking for black pepper, and especially because that was incredibly valuable, but didn't find them, but did found chilies. Originally, they were quite excited to have found these, saw they potentially wealth potential as well as medicinal properties. And by 1513, chilies did appear to be quite common in gardens in Spain and Italy. And we find written about in these kind of, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo Valdés wrote about it. But perhaps they weren't yet, loved and eaten a lot in the Mediterranean. For example, even in the 18th century, we've got this Vincenzo Corrado in Italy talking about how they're a vulgar rustic food, which is a sort of theme we'll touch upon later. However, it's through the Portuguese that this ingredient comes over to Asia, and Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498. And just before this, the Treaty of Tordesillas kind of effectively split the globe between Spanish and Portuguese empirical designs, which meant that the sort of all East, as we consider it in the sort of westernized atlas, is largely Portuguese, apart from Brazil, so we're sort of bringing things across. Portuguese merchants reached Japan in 1543, and Nagasaki was open to trade in the late 16th century. And then through the Hideyoshi invasions, the Japanese came over to Korea, and with that came seeds and knowledge of chili propagation. So that's how we get there. So first of all, we're going to look at the actors and agents in this kind of process. So the main themes we're going to talk about here is the greater zeal and the speed with which chilies were adopted into the Korean peninsula, but more importantly, I'm going to talk about this reflection of how chilies became apparently quite common in gardens and in everyday homes, but upper classes were more reluctant to incorporate it and to use it. But the difference is that there were different reasons for this. So this appeared to be a case in Iberia of an issue of class and economic reasons, conspicuous consumption, things like that, whereas in Korea this appears to have been the actual spiciness of the chili itself to a certain extent. So, as I said before, the Spanish were initially quite interested and hopeful for the chili. So this is written in the Columbus diaries. The land was found, the land being, the Americas, to produce much ají, which is chili, which is the pepper of the natives, and more valuable than the common sort. They deem it very wholesome and eat nothing without it. 50 caravels might be loaded every year with this commodity in Hispaniola. So he's talking about already planning to be importing this back to the European mainland. And then Bartolomé de las Casas, who's also part of the Columbus expeditions. The chili is regarded as a healthy spice according to our doctors, so they also saw potential health benefits of the chili and thought maybe this could add to its kind of money-spinning nature, which ultimately was kind of a large part of the purpose of their trip. By the mid-16th century, it is clear that chilies were popular on the European mainland, particularly part of the Spanish Empire. So again, we've got de las Casas saying in mid-16th century that everything these people eat, so whether it be cooked or stewed, has pepper in it, which is known throughout Spain. So already 50, 60 years later, it is known throughout Spain. So in terms of agriculture, it's, grown massively. And again, here we've got Monard sort of saying a similar thing. It's excellent and it's known throughout Spain. There's no garden or orchard or port where it does not grow, given how beautiful its fruit is. So I should say is, obviously, ignore my thumbs. So, very clearly it's being grown quite a lot. However, recipe books from this period don't really feature much chilies. So, for example, in Libro de Guisados, we've got 242 recipes, 88 mentions of cinnamon, and 30 mentions of black pepper. So spicing's not an issue. These spices that have been around for a bit longer, these spices from Asia originally, but there's not a lot of mention of, there's no chili of red pepper in this book at all. Similar with Libro de la Cocina, they've, got all kinds of Mediterranean recipes, Spanish, Italian, and then German as well, but no chili, but there is cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, and others. So we see that even though there is already this proclivity for spice, and spices are valued, chilies not so much. So there are two possible reasons for this. There could be a suspicion towards or lack of desire to emulate Native American practices. This, I think, is less compelling, but it's an idea that we're going to have a quick look at. But the one that I really want to focus on is the lack of sort of money-spinning potential. So they didn't really contribute so much to the conspicuous consumption that upper-class eaters really looked for in Asian spices. So here we've got, I'm not going to read all the way through this, but basically from the Columbus Diaries, this idea that you've got the indigenous people, they're sort of, there was a certain respect towards the the sort of the quite hierarchical and quite established societies that were occurring, obviously centuries old societies, but there was, quite this idea in the diaries, this underlying idea that, the native people were so interested and that they could be so speedily converted to Christianity, and they were ripe for being, this idea that the culture should be going from Spain to the indigenous people of the Americas, not the other way around, which, we could look at. I've got more evidence for that, but I think that's less important right now. I'm not going to talk about that too much because we want to get through it, and it's not the one I like too much. So here's the better argument. So the idea that the chilies were less expensive and much more easily propagated than other spices, which does, help show why they were grown so much, and why they'd spread so quickly, but also why courts and people looking for this consumption didn't want it. So Monard's saying they're different, in that those from India are very expensive. These simply have to be planted, and they provide spices all year long with less trouble and greater benefit. So yeah, that's sort of my main point. It was the availability of chilies compared to the inaccessibility of previous spices that secured them as a second-rate ingredient in the upper-class households of Southern Europe and of, the Iberian Peninsula. So if we now look at the actors and agents of chilies in Korea, we've got the same pattern is generally reflected. So the first, but much quicker, so the first actual mention written of chilies in terms of like food is much quicker, but they are discussed as being a great poison. So again, we have this similar idea that the upper classes, they were everywhere, but the upper classes weren't quite sure about eating them. But this, I want to analyze more in terms of Neo-Confucianism and Neo-Confucian propriety, which was discussed in our previous talk, in terms of being, not this heavy spicing was less appropriate, shall we say. So not a cookbook, but here's Park Ji-won's Yangbanjeon, so Story of a Yangban. So I know some of you will have read it, but this story of, a man who wants to become a Yangban, desperately buys his way into it, and then realizes that maybe it's not quite the life he wants to live, is the essence of it. But there are, it basically runs through this long, long list of all the things that a Yangban can and can't do. And a lot of these relate to eating as well. So, when eating, they must not drink the broth first, and they do not make a slurping sound. They never make a pounding sound when eating with chopsticks, nor do they eat raw green onions. When drinking wine, they do not suck in their moustache, and when smoking their pipe, they don't suck in so that their cheeks become concave. So it's all these sort of silly little things that they can't do, and, it's a satirical kind of piece on it. But interestingly here, they do not eat raw green onions. So this is, a lot of us will have eaten raw onions. It's not great for your breath. It's not great as you don't want to go to a fancy dinner and then be talking at someone and breathing onion all over them. And also for the humor, I don't know, anyone might have felt that your tummy goes a bit when you've had spicy onions, right? And that's all part of this idea that the humor is important and you can't have anything that sort of aggravates you too much. This is not from Yangbanjeon, this is from Kyeopjeongso, ignore that. But this is from a chapter entitled, 5 things for noblemen to consider whilst they're eating. So we've got the second point that she talks about is to count up the great virtues and follow their guidance. So serve your parents, serve your king, establish a name for your family, all things that are very important as part of Neo-Confucianism that you need to keep doing whilst you're eating. Importantly, try not to beautify the taste of something too much. So again, this is this idea of, as discussed before, largely performative idea of you can't have anything that's too delicious or too spicy or too exciting. So yeah, and then similarly in the next one, to desire good food and scowl upon food that's not delicious and to eat throughout the day without knowing the way in which it has come into being is foolish. So again, this idea of gluttony being bad, which is in most cultures, but particularly bad. And we also have, as an example, this 4-7 debate that was occurring at the time. So the idea that composure is an outward expression of moral virtue. So, the principles of humanity, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are, all shown through your control of your feelings. And and this kind of comes into it. So, you know, in short, the 7 feelings are controlled by your 4 beginnings, or the body and the mind, and you don't want to sort of be eating things that are too aggravating. So chilies clearly didn't fit in with this upper class Neo-Confucian idea of propriety, initially at least, and so that kind of is similar to that trajectory in Spain of that upper class. Quickly, I'm going a lot slower than I should be, but we're going to talk quickly about the methods and adaptation, so the recipes in which they came in and how these are again quite similar. So in both areas, chili peppers largely became ingrained in, they were incorporated into existing culinary practices, subtly changing existing recipes and traditions and forming a blended output rather than being incorporated into with their own new dishes. And again, these were for slightly different reasons. In the Spanish context, again, it was largely economic, so for not the upper classes, but for more everyday people, and again, it took longer, but this was replacing very expensive spices with another kind of spice, whereas in Korea, there were slightly more varied reasons for this. So here is, I looked at, for a study in the Iberian case, I looked at stews and stew recipes, because now one of the quite common uses of paprika or pimenton is in stews, particularly poultry stews. So as a kind of example, I took all the chicken stew recipes in this book called Libro de Guisados, and as you can see, we've got various different spices being used in all of them, which is kind of a situation in which paprika is used today. So what we've got here is, this is a recipe again for a kind of a stew. On the one side from 1529 from this book, and on the right-hand side, we've got something from a website, the Recetas del Señor, which is a very, inventive title, from 2020 for, again, a kind of stew recipe. And what we see, if we look into it, is where all the spices are being used on the left-hand side, it's pimenton, or paprika, on the right-hand side. So both are similar recipes. At their core, they're cooked poultry added to a broth or stew into which spices are added before being allowed to cook and impart flavour. So a pretty, route one stew. The multitude of spices used in Nola's recipe on the left are in effect replaced by paprika in the modern recipe on the right, which reflects the observation by Monard, as we saw before, again, sort of reiterating this idea that they used wherever aromatic spices from the Malaccas or India might be used. A similar process we can see in the development of Korean recipes. For example, we've got the development of gochujang, so a really important ingredient, base of huge amounts of Korean food now, which builds upon existing culinary practices of fermented soybeans, as we saw 3 talks ago. So we've got a recipe for chang here from Salim Youngju, so just a pretty basic soy sauce recipe. Then on the right, we've got a gochujang recipe from Jjajangmyeon. And you can see that the fundamentals of the fermentation process are very similar. You've got the production of meju or malchang, which is dried in the sun and then combined with water and salt to allow to ferment. Even the quantities of salt to meju in each recipe is very similar. It's just, even though one's making sauce and one's making a paste, it's just the addition of chili that's kind of changed. So it's just adding a little thing extra to already existing recipes. I'm taking a bit of time, so I'll kind of speed through this. But obviously kimchi is one of the ingredients as well that we see chili really exert an influence. Here are 2 recipes from Jjajangmyeon where we see chilies added in what's described as a sufficient amount. So already by the 19th century, we're seeing chilies are becoming so important and useful in kimchi that people are sort of, or women who cook regularly at least, are to know what it's like adding to taste, right? So it's something that is it's almost a given that you'll know how much you're adding. Another thing, to talk about briefly, I've not timed this particularly well, but we'll speed through it, is the contribution of chilies to this balance of flavors and also to a balance of colors. So here's a quote from Jjajangmyeon again that I'll allow you to read yourselves, but it's basically talking about, the balance of the 4 elements in food and the balance of all the flavors you want to have, and chilies adding this heating element. So that sort of eventually helped ingratiate it in. So whilst on one hand it's not suitable because it's too spicy, on the other hand, if it can be rearranged and brought in And in particular, it was really important in terms of the color red. So when we see chili and kimchi, this red adds a new color to, you know, dishes and palettes across, or plates across the Korean cuisines. And here, if we look at two recipes from both before and after chilies were introduced, actually, we see that red is already being used, but not in chilies. It's being used to dye food. So in this recipe for japchae and in this recipe for tonghwa kimchi, both of them use coxcomb flowers or bellflower root to turn something red and to dye an ingredient. So this is both ingredients, japchae and tonghwa kimchi, where one might then replace this with chilies or with pepper colors to add that color red. So having sped through that, in conclusion, what I was discussing today is that overall there are similarities to be drawn between the adoption of chilies in Korea and the Iberian Peninsula. Both regions show similar patterns in the trajectory in terms of the agents of adoption. So the chili garnered slight mistrust amongst upper echelons of society, despite appearing to have been widely grown and used by the everyday people, again with different speeds and lengths of this stagnation in each area. The reasons for this are slightly different. In Iberia, it seemed more about its cheapness, effectively, whereas in Korea, it was more about sort of quite surface level moral and philosophical objections to the spicy nature. However, there is also similarity in both regions in the manner in which they were adopted, both being brought into existing culinary practices rather than developing their own kind of recipes. And yeah, I guess that's kind of, sorry, that's really petered out. Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much.
So, Rory, I have a question about procedure since we're running low on time. So I thought maybe we could invite the speakers back up, and I would just, instead of giving prepared remarks which are dull, just abuse my sort of discussant privilege and ask the first set of questions. Would that be all right? So could I invite them back to the stage? We have a nice seat right there in these like mid-century modern chairs. This very expensive building. So I promise to be very brief because I don't want to monopolize, even though I have probably a lot of questions, which I'll bother you about later. And I see that there are speaker phones. Okay, so I'll just do these in order, just so that I'm equitable. So I'm going to just start with Professor Lee's paper on the origins of Korean bread and butter. I have many, many questions. I'm sort of thrilled that you were able to so clearly explain the methods for teasing out information from the prehistoric past. And I was really, very, very sort of intrigued by the sort of focus on non-domesticated plants, which I think is a very novel and interesting sort of way of approaching the subject matter. So I have a couple of questions, and I'll just limit myself to two. The first one, actually, is I'm thinking a lot about non-domesticates like acorns and other things that don't require a lot of effort to cultivate. And I'm wondering if you think that that kind of knowledge spreads more easily without the effort of very intensive cultural contact. And then my second question is really basic and probably a little silly, which is I'm very intrigued by the soybeans, because you mentioned them as a sort of a protein source. But from my work on sort of the history of tofu, the Chinese cultivated soybeans for hundreds and hundreds of years before they even thought to make it a protein sort of source. And in fact, they were eating as a poor man's grain, and also there were some sort of soil enhancing sort of features too. So I thought I'd just ask about what you think the soybean is doing at this point, and should I just give you a chance to answer and then go on to the next person?
Thank you. I'll answer as quickly as clearly possible. First, the wild plants is one part easy, the other part more difficult than crops. Easy part is you don't cultivate, but harvesting, knowing the season, when to harvest, where to harvest, is knowledge that transmitted orally generation by generation. Often wild food has a toxic. For example, acorn has tannin, which only squirrel can digest in low. So it needs a lot of cooking and they're leaching the tannin. So Neolithic sites, we have a water-filled pits that drain the toxic from acorns. So those are, so in a way, agriculture is labor intensive, but that's only coming later. From the Neolithic period, probably like millet farming is more like a side job. And if I answer that first question, I'll go into the second one, soybean. Probably wild soybean, which is widely spread in East Asia, which is conspecific, which can hybrid with the domestic soybean later, probably was ruderic wheat, or the wheat in the field, millet field. So probably farmers probably noticed when wild soybeans growing, millet doing better because nitrogen fixing nutrient property of the soybean. And the soybean often in Korea mixed with the rice as part of protein and meal. So probably it well before any kind of sauce making or tofu, which is tofu making is introduced to Korea dynasty later from China. It probably used as part of the supplement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I move on to the second question. So this is from to Professor Kwok. I want to just do the archaeology first for so coherent reasons. So I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay, so I had some questions about, so I'm very interested in lipid analysis because I've been sort of like spending a fair amount of time sort of obsessing about the history of dairy in China. And it sounds like you found evidence of potential dairy consumption. Or did I misunderstand that?
For dairy consumption, actually, not in prehistoric time period. Actually, we actually in European countries in European continent, they found a lot of dairy consumption at that prehistoric time period. But in Korea, as far as I analyzed, about like several hundreds of sures so far, and then so far as now, I only found two evidence of two samples that has kind of dairy consumption. It actually came from early history time period, like 삼국시대, at the Three Kingdoms period in Korea. Yeah.
Well, the reason I bring it up is that there was a find last year. That there was a discovery in Shanxi in the sort of, or was it Shanxi? It might have been Shanxi actually, in a sort of marginal transitional area that was, where there's pastoralists and agriculturalists in the same place. They found widespread evidence of dairy consumption, but not. I think it's based on the dental plaque, and I was wondering actually if you could speak to whether people are doing things with teeth in Korean archaeology at this point, because it seems like it could also supplement, the sort of the lipid analysis that you're doing.
Yes, we can actually conduct some sort of isomer analysis on teeth as well, but it's different from lipid analysis. It's teeth actually is also can provide a lot of information related to ancient diet. But in Korea, it's pretty seldom actually. There are not a lot of like many examples of actually teeth analysis being conducted. So it's I think it's still a way to go. But yeah, it has high potential. And actually, even it's really a kind of harsh condition, acid condition, since teeth is the hardest part of a human body. So it's relatively its survival rate is better than other part of bones. So I think it has a high potential of this. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm excited to read about it. Okay, so then I move on to Professor Son, and I'm actually a historian, so I'm gonna try not to overdo this here. I guess I wanted just to ask you a simple, like a factual question, because I can't help myself, and then a sort of a broader, maybe more sort of a more unwieldy question. So the simple question is, I saw the word dumpling on your screen, and I'm wondering what the word was. Was it like, are we thinking of a rice dumpling, or are we thinking like a wheat dumpling, like a mandu? It's simple. This is a long story about why I'm interested in this question. And then the second question is that I was looking at the title, and I assumed that the text that you focused on was written in Sinitic. Mm-hmm. And I was like thinking, okay, I'm very interested in the question of, like in China, there isn't a lot of fixation on getting women in the pre-modern period to cook. I don't know if it's because it's assumed. There isn't even that much of a concern about the market. Maybe it's a mercantile people. But this idea that women should read cooking books is extraordinary to me, since much of this is the kind of stuff that you don't write down. But also the fact is that manual, the work that you were examining seems to be a book, written in Sinitic. Is that correct? And is it directed at other men, I assume? So I wanted to kind of ask the question of like masculinity, because it's easy to kind of import American sort of mid-century ideas about gender roles into the Korean past, where especially when we know that the domestic sphere isn't commensurate with the inner quarters, right? I mean, managing an aristocratic household is also a man's job as well. So I was thinking, like, could we hear more about masculinity in the way that food connoisseurship, which is a huge thing in Southern Chinese male culture to this very day, how does that work? And, just to kind of, just because I think of gender not as an absolute, but, a relational thing. And so I'd be kind of interested in knowing, also maybe, and here I go again, sort of thinking about the China connection, because, in the Ming, food consumption becomes highly, sort of a spot for a lot of contentious discussion about luxury consumption and so forth. So I thought I would just kind of ask those questions. I hope it's not too much.
Yeah, those are really big questions. Thank you so much. And then first question about that the term for the mandu, actually it's not very simple in a way that, because as you see that there are so many extant cookbooks was both written in literary knitting and the vernacular Korean script. So which means that sometimes they are really influencing each other. So sometimes they use the term that was widely popularly used in the popular practice in Joseon Korea, but also they constantly translated the term from the so-called encyclopedia imported from the China. So sometimes I think the term itself is really mixed, like mandu, gyoja, and then sanghwa, and then all these different terms actually used in a very different way. And then also I wanted to point out that one of the big differences when you're thinking about the dumplings in Joseon Korea and then Qing China or the China, in a way that because in Joseon Korea there are not much harvest in flour, because flour is a really expensive thing. So most of the skin was made of the buckwheat, or even for the luxurious case, and then they kind of slice the thin of the fish and they use that as a skin of the dumpling. So that's actually really one of the clear characteristic differences between the so-called Chinese cookbooks and then Joseon Korean books. And second one is about the food masculinity. That's actually really fascinating question. Because I already wanted to really emphasize that the femininity and the masculinity was constantly historically and specifically constructed one, right? So it's actually same in Joseon Korea, because that most of the professional cooks, like working in royal kitchen, was men. And then also local official kitchen called kwancheong, and then they are also the male slaves. So basically that they emphasized women's labor of cooking only in domestic space. And then, but I think this is really ironical in the sense because their emphasis of food as a ritual food for the ancestry, the ritual. So for that matter, yeah, these are actually the ancestral ritual was not only concern for the men and not only for the concern for the women and the men. So there are so many male scholars actually talking about that, how to prepare for the food, for the ancestral ritual, and then some of the really famous scholars even indulge themselves in preparing food by themselves. And then in this case, that the textbook usually describes that, oh yeah, he is the one actually, kind of really the one who fulfilled that his filial piety for his ancestors and then parents-in-law, and then they does not necessarily make male's cooking less masculine in that way. So I think this is really interesting dynamic between the gender and then construction of the masculinity and then femininity. And then the question about the comparison, actually that's really, really fascinating. So the cookbooks are really interesting in a way that we can think about the East Asia, but the cookbooks development was widely different, particularly in the Ming-Qing China, and most of the cookbooks were written by male literati, and then they are really focused on the food connoisseurship, and then of course there are really famous example of Yuan Mei, and then Xue Shidan, and then he wrote the really famous cookbooks, but when you actually look at the cookbooks, it's really hard to follow. So sometimes you really can see that these cookbooks were shaped not necessarily as the practical manuals for practice of cooking, but more like that the show off of his cultural skill and then connoisseurship. So those kind of the impulses were really predominated by in the production of the cookbooks and cookery writings in the Ming-Qing China. But in Joseon Korean case, of course we see a lot of the male literati talking about the taste and the flavor of food, but at the same time, most of the cookbooks were written both by men and women. And then in this case, women, we really cannot make any kind of clear distinction, okay, men just based on the textual knowledge and the women based on that embodied skill, because those women are really smart and then they can read the literary Sinitic and then also the fluent in vernacular Korean. So they constantly read all the cookbooks written in Sinitic script and then even the cookbooks imported from China and then copy and paste most of the recipes in their cookbooks. So I think this is a really peculiar moment to make what they really think about knowledge and then how they really wanted to push that the knowledge they know from their everyday life into the realm of the legitimate knowledge that could be acknowledged by society. They kind of know that there are certain rhetoric they have to use for that matter in the way they constantly referring their practical practice with the textual sources. So that's actually really fascinating. Thank you.
It's very interesting. Thank you. And then my final question is for Neem. And did I pronounce your name correctly? Neem. Okay. So I have a special skill. I can botch a name in any language. So so here we go. So I'm fascinated with this discussion of chilies. I actually have lots of questions to ask you later that have to do with New World crops. But for now, I'm actually very interested in the question of adoption in the Korean Peninsula. And I guess I had a question about how it happened because, I was thinking like, I was at a conference several weeks ago, and we were talking about sort of the movement of sort of foods from Africa, West Africa, to the Americas, and often it was people who brought it over, and it usually came in things like the germ that would come over and shipped, and as part of the provision. So I was actually interested in the question of how the chili gets to Asia, and whether, we're really dealing with Iberian actors as much as sort of Mesoamerican, natives, mestizos, population, maybe even people that are enslaved parties. We know that there's, the Portuguese are not picky about who they sell into servitude, right? And we know that some of the people, from East Asia that are kidnapped and sold into slavery return at some point. So I was wondering about, do we have any textual evidence about how, cultivating the chili pepper works? I mean, I'll just say as an aside, one of the things I've done as a sort of informal, I guess, experimental archaeologist or anthropologist or historian is to try and grow things in my own garden, and I've managed to kill everything. So it has sort of struck me as you kind of need some, maybe people-to-people sort of connection in order to get a plant off the ground in a new environment. And this kind of leads my sort of second question, which is maybe a little bit more wide-ranging and probably unfair, which is, to what extent do you see the sort of adoption of the chili pepper as part of a larger package of goods, foodstuffs that come from the Americas to Korea? I'm thinking of sweet potatoes and other things that, the poor people sort of eat because they often are sort of pushed into marginal lands like hills, which are not very good for, growing sort of, staple crops like rice and millet and wheat. So I guess I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the material, conditions of this kind of transfer.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I'm actually not just, but over the past sort of year getting into as well. I come from a sort of more of a literary and manuscript. I've written things actually very similar to what you were talking about, so we will talk about that later. But so I think this is stuff that I'm also finding very interesting right now. In terms of your first question, it's, again, it's sort of muddy. It's unsure specifically who brings things over, right? But in terms of chilies actually first reaching Asia, and with the Portuguese reaching India, there's actually a couple writings of botanists and historians largely from Europe talking about, how there was originally a lot of idea that they thought that chilies must have grown natively to India and to South Asia because of how widespread it became in such a short period. But it's also thought that the Portuguese were trying to peddle it, thought that it would have been, very, very popular. Again, saw that they'd taken black pepper and spices from over there and gone, wow, this chili's gonna, blow up. And can we, like I was saying, how the original sort of Columbus expedition saw potential for wealth there, in a slightly sort of different angle of that the Portuguese perhaps were purposefully selling it and propagating it in India. In terms of making its way, again, we think it's sort of similar from Portugal to Japan, but then that's where it kind of hands over, right? Because the Portuguese weren't going to Korea, not with that levels, and they weren't bringing things over. It's an interesting, this is kind of tangential, to see the sort of how the chili fared in Japan compared to Korea, which is something I'm now working on, and that how it was, it's, again, there's writings that whether this is kind of more myth writing than sort of pseudo-historical, that Korean kings actually had sort of had begged for, had begged, again, this is not the right word, but had asked for knowledge of how to propagate the chili and were sort of denied, and then eventually sort of allowed it. Again, these are problematic ways of phrasing it. But there's this idea that whether that's true or whether that's more of a sort of retroactive look at how much the chili has now succeeded on the Korean peninsula, that they must have wanted it so badly because of how it suits their tastes. But in short, we're not entirely sure who the actors are. But the original movement to Asia does seem to have been a sort of Portuguese-led transfer over. In terms of the chili as a larger packet of goods, that's absolutely correct. It's definitely part of this wider Colombian exchange. As you say, sweet potato is the big one. That's the one that, so as part of this is my first case study of several, looking at several ingredients and methods in China and Japan, and sweet potatoes and tomatoes are two of the other ones that are, tomatoes less importantly, but sweet potato is that sort of, that's a big economic, this sort of poverty food kind of idea of it. And like how I said, how chilies are, they did spread so quickly because they were so easy to propagate and because they were a replacement for otherwise, in Europe at least, for otherwise quite expensive spices. Sweet potato is very much a similar trajectory, but for more necessity than flavor and for color, right? So to an even greater extent, because they were a famine food in, Korea and in China and in Japan. So they were a kind of, replacement where rice couldn't grow. So chili very much is part of this wider movement. But the materiality of chili is less important than of other ingredients that were sustenance.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess I'm supposed to, we have 6 minutes left for questions. Okay, so I guess I should open up the floor. I've been selfish and monopolize the speakers. So I guess I'm supposed to like. No, okay. Yes.
Thank you so much. These are such interesting presentations. I'm Millian Kong from UMass Amherst. I'm on the next panel. So I was fascinated that rice in particular was, a yangbang, it wasn't something that everyone could eat. So I'm just wondering, was there an effort to sort of control some of these, in the chilies also, or, to sort of keep them only available to the upper classes, or how did they become so widely disseminated and adopted by the masses?
I can answer a little bit. Rice farming is more involved in the dry field farming because it needs irrigation. Through probably it is record that rice become a part of taxation material commodity probably through the Three Kingdom period. So effort continued to Korea and Joseon dynasty. By the mid-Joseon dynasty, 6,000 irrigation reservoir were constructed with the government effort, as well as they made a local office for managing this irrigation field. But this is a later history. Is for taxation for royalty and aristocrats. Most people are not, only is kind of ritual food or festival food. And they say that prehistoric period, rice probably was never been a main food. And probably some commodity to trading. And it's only the modern history that the rice become really major food from 1970s in Korea, actually. Yes.
Yeah, so whenever I talked about the cookbooks in Joseon Korea, I always got the question, is there any cookbooks in Joseon Korea? In a way that I think it's true. Predominantly, most of the population of Joseon Korea are still pretty much suffering from famine and the frequent droughts and the flooding and every kind of thing. So most of cookbooks actually emerged from certain context, but most of them actually from that the so-called feminine food that Guhang Chalyo that the Professor Lee already introduced as kind of state policy that how to make people survive during these kind of natural disasters. So when I'm thinking about the emergence of all these cookbooks, and then this is specifically point to that the certain historical period of the 18th and the 19th century, and then I kind of also suspect that these cookbooks were produced and circulated and transmitted initially at the pretty much a small number of elite families who could easily get access to all kinds of the foodstuffs, because those are things are really not easily the things that the commoner people could get. So yeah, but most of the, particularly in the 18th and 19th century cookbooks, and then they really do not talk much about the rice and then porridge, because this is already pretty much very common, ordinary food. And then instead they talking about all kinds of delicacies and then the dishes with meat and then all kinds of certain spices and those kind of things. So I kind of assume, particularly upper echelon of the society in the late Joseon Korea, and then rice is pretty much already accepted as the everyday meal, and then it's not sure how much degree we can applicable to that the commoners and the slaves class, but that's actually my guess.
Yeah, kind of similar to what you said. So a lot of, again, these cookbooks are either sort of a reflection of very much upper class interest as well in China. So for example, that Suiyuan Shidan is very sort of looking at the amount of, whereas even if you compare it to the Yangban female written recipes like Kyuhap there's a lot more grains in Kyuhap compared, the grain section is one of the larger sections of the recipes in Kyuhap compared to, you know, meat and vegetables, whereas in Suiyuan Shidan, this male-authored, very sort of gastronomical treatise, you know, the one that's very difficult to cook from, there's very few grain and there's no basic rice or grain recipes, and it's all meats, whole animals, things like this. So that naturally doesn't reflect what everyday people were eating. So we can't really tell what of those ingredients were better to eat, or, you know, more accessible and less accessible. In terms of the chili, that is kind of the opposite way around from rice. Like I said, it was, again, we don't have cookbooks for sort of everyday people or non-Yangban people just because of how writing worked. But in terms of from sort of botanical works and encyclopedias, it's written as a pretty common thing that's grown quite a lot. But it's not talked about as being eaten for a lot longer. And like I said, in these kind of performative things of we can't eat things too spicy, we know that's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily what people are eating. People are eating spicy things. But in terms of the performative nature of it, it's like not supposed to be eaten so much. So chilies were kind of in the opposite direction, where Yangban were eating it, but they were writing as if they weren't, whereas it was grown regularly by common people because it was much cheaper for flavoring.
One more thing add is rice during the Bronze Age, which was first adopted in Korean Peninsula, is not for as a main food, but I believe this is kind of collective community work to make irrigation and making rice paddy field. So it is more like a labor of community work for cohesion, and also special occasion like ritual, which is ritual features increased, including barriers during the Bronze Age. So more symbolic food.
So I think we're out of time, right? Okay. Well, yeah, thank you to the speakers.